The Persian army was in full retreat, after having been dealt a critical blow on the plain of Marathon by the Athenians and their allies. But the day was not yet over, as the Persian commander attempted to pull one final trick from his sleeve. As even though the Persians were defeated, their army was not yet spent. The armada set sail towards Sunion, intending to circumvent Attica and attack the city of Athens, which was now completely defenseless. Seeing this, Miltiades left a small contingent of Athenians to gather their dead, and the rest of the exhausted but victorious Hoplites began a forced march back to Athens. It was here where the legendary Marathon race would be born. A runner was sent to Athens to inform the citizens of their victory, and after a couple of hours, the runner was able to reach Athens and deliver his message. "Nenekakemen," he cried before collapsing and dying from exhaustion. Thus, the Athenians now knew of their magnificent triumph and were able to prepare for a potential Persian counterattack. The both mentally and physically exhausted Athenians were able to reach Athens just before the Persians appeared on the horizon, and thanks to their heroic efforts, the city would be saved. As observing the Athenian hoplites already arrayed for battle and waiting for them along the shore, the Persian armada, after riding at anchor for a while, decided to sail back to Asia. Arguably, this was the most important victory that the Greeks had achieved in their history up until this point. Without the triumph at Marathon, Western civilization would probably have looked very different today, and perhaps maybe not even have existed at all. From the Persian perspective, this was an unexpected step back, as two of their main objectives had been achieved during the expedition. Eretria was punished, and Naxos was no more. However, the Athenians were not yet subjugated. If anything, this was more of a blow to the prestige of the Persian king rather than a military step back. As when Darius learned about the outcome of the Battle of Marathon, he was completely enraged, and therefore began raising a new army, which was meant to completely subjugate the entirety of Greece. Since this was to be a full-scale invasion and occupation, the entire resources of the greatest empire of the ancient world were to be mobilized. Preparations began in earnest as early as 490 BCE, and for 3 whole years Asia was shaken by Darius' messages. Commanding the equipment of armies and provisions, the unprecedented scale of the invasion required long-term planning, stockpiling, and conscription. Then at around 486 BCE, the Egyptians revolted against Persian rule, postponing any expedition into Greece. The great king Darius also died in 486 whilst preparing to march on Egypt. Thus, the fateful task of invading Greece, along with avenging the burning of Sardis and the defeat of Marathon, fell upon the shoulders of his son and successor, Xerxes I. Xerxes acted decisively and crushed the Egyptian revolt during the same year, before entirely devoting himself to the task of building up his Greek invasion force. For 5 years, the Persian invasion was in preparation. A huge army from all corners of the empire was gathered at Sardis. Supply depots were built along the planned route of the Persian army, and even a canal was dug across the isthmus of Mount Athos, near which a Persian fleet was destroyed in 492 BCE. In 481, Xerxes sent ambassadors around Greece requesting earth and water, which was probably a ceremonial way of demanding submission. However, he had deliberately omitted Athens and Sparta, since his intention was to destroy both cities, and as such, it would be a life or death struggle from the onset. Naturally, the Greeks that endeavored to resist the Persians blocked around these two leading states. Thus, for the first time in their history, the Greeks formed an unofficial confederation of city-states with one common cause: the salvation of Hellas. The Athenians had been preparing for war with the Persians, and around 482 BCE, under the guidance of the Athenian politician Themistocles, they decided to build a massive fleet of triremes. Themistocles persuaded the Athenian assembly to build the fleet after interpreting a Delphic prophecy in such a way that would favor this course of action, whilst at the same time the Spartans would attain the de facto military leadership of this pan-Hellenic coalition. In the spring of 480 BCE, the Persian army was finally ready. Estimations and speculations about the size of the Persian army that marched against Greece are still debated to this day. However, the army is often cited as the largest invasion force in all of ancient history. Suffice to say that according to the more modest, modern estimates, the invasion force was around 100,000 men and accompanied by approximately 1,200 triremes. But we should not forget that preparations for this expedition were undergoing for almost a decade beforehand. so it is entirely possible that this force may have been even larger. This enormous force then marched on Abydos, and from there the whole army crossed the Hellespont. 2 pontoon bridges, a masterpiece of engineering for their time, were made specifically for this reason. Time was running out for the Greek coalition. The allies met at Corinth in the spring of 480, where a Thessalian delegation beseeched the coalition to send an advancing force to stop the Persian onslaught. For it is not right that we should be left to stand alone for an outpost of Hellas, and so perish for your stakes. If you will not stand it, be assured that we shall make terms with the Persians, they exclaimed. Thereupon the Greeks decided to send an army by sea to Thessaly to guard the pass. Around 10,000 hoplites, under the leadership of a Spartan general and the Athenian leader Themistocles, were dispatched and soon reached Tempe. However, once there, the generals were soon approached by King Alexander I of Macedonia, who warned them that the Vale could be bypassed and that the army of Xerxes was enormous. With this new information at hand, the Greek force retreated, abandoning Thessaly to its fate. Meanwhile, King Xerxes and his gigantic force were marching through Thrace. According to Herodotus, the army was so huge that even the rivers were drunk dry by the sheer number of beasts that were consuming from it. By late July, the Persian army and fleet reunited at the city of Therma. The Greek coalition, however, was now facing another crisis, as the Thessalians had now turned over to the Persians, and as a result, the strategic situation was getting worse by the minute. They consulted together on how and where they should make their stand, and after considering all the topographic and tactical advantages of each position, the opinion that prevailed most was that of the Athenian Themistocles. His political and tactical genius seemingly shone brighter during times of adversity, as not only did Themistocles have to consider the military aspect of dealing with a seemingly unstoppable force, but he also had to balance the delicate and complicated political relations between the members of this Greek coalition. Fearing that the Spartans would be reluctant to march out of the Peloponnese after the debacle at Tempe, he reassured them that the Athenians were willing to do everything necessary for victory. With that, the Athenian and allied navies would block the straits at Artemisium, whilst the land route to southern Greece would require Xerxes to march through a narrow pass that could be easily blocked by a much smaller force of Hoplites. This confined piece of land that the Greeks decided to make their stand was named Thermopylae. The Greek land force sent by the coalition to block the pass at Thermopylae was to be commanded by one of the 2 Spartan kings, a man in his 60s who went by the name of Leonidas. Leonidas became king rather unexpectedly, since he was the 3rd son and subsequently the 3rd in line for succession. His reign was also rather uneventful up until this point, but the Persian invasion set in motion a course of events that would render his name synonymous with heroism. At this time of year, the Spartans were celebrating a religious festival, and as such, military activity was forbidden by Spartan law. Facing the exact same situation as they did during the first Persian invasion of Greece, which only ended after the surprise Athenian victory over the Persians at Marathon. On top of all that, it was also the time of the Olympic Games, and therefore an Olympic truce which forbade hostilities was in place. Despite these religious scruples, the Spartan ephors decided that the threat was sufficient enough to justify an advanced force. In addition to this, there had also been a recent Delphic prophecy, which the Spartans, giving their deep religious sentiment, would not have taken lightly. Earlier in the year, the Delphic oracle prophesied that either Sparta would be laid to waste by a foreigner, or that a Spartan king would be killed. With these considerations in mind, Leonidas decided to choose an elite force of 300 Spartan citizens, all of whom had living sons, so that their deaths would not extinguish any Spartan family lines. Leonidas' decision to make his stand at Thermopylae was not only motivated by religious concerns. As since Sparta was also the military leader of this fragile Greek coalition, if it was to stand any chance of surviving this predicament, it needed to set an example of defiance and heroism. Leonidas and his hoplites intended to provide just that. Around mid-August 480 BCE, King Leonidas, together with his 300 Spartans and 900 helots, marched out towards Thermopylae. At the same time, the Greek allied fleet sailed towards Artemisium. The king was reinforced en route by contingents of various city-states of the coalition. Soon a force of around 7,000 Greek hoplites, led by King Leonidas, reached the small pass at Thermopylae. There Leonidas found an old wall that was built by local Greeks but in a ruinous condition, so the Greeks immediately set about repairing it. Soon afterwards, the Persian horde headed by the great king Xerxes arrived and encamped just a few miles off the pass at Thermopylae. The legend of 300 Spartans was about to be born. Thank you for watching our video on the prelude to the Battle of Thermopylae. If you have made it this far, please consider subscribing, sharing, commenting, and all the other good stuff that tricks the YouTube gods into sharing our video with as many people as possible. A big thank you to Okes Balaam for giving me the opportunity to narrate this presentation. If you would like to hear more of my slightly sinister vocal tones, you can do so by visiting the Faceless Narrator here on YouTube, where we focus on the unusual and often more macabre characters from ancient history. Until next time, Shirianish Shaharij.